I seen a massive hand reach out to Ted's hand as the man stood up. I hadn't realized he was sitting. They were face to face until he stood. He towered over my father and Ted. He was covered in hair from head to foot. Hello and welcome back to Talk About Strange. I hope you guys are ready for a really special episode. I decided to find a fitting environment to sit in to tell you guys this story. I know you guys have been chomping at the bit waiting for a story. I know you've also been patient, but I know I've been chomping at the bit wanting to share a story. I received this one back just as we were closing up shop, and I've just been dying to share it. Just too busy, and we're coming along really well on the house. My office, obviously the studio isn't done. I ran all the electric this week. I've been working on that and plumbing. We're not done with the plumbing yet. I still have a lot of that to do, but it's coming along really good. Then I'm gonna have my brother come in and spray foam. We're gonna hang sheetrock. That office is coming soon. But I do want to do something out here at some point that we can come out here and do a story now and then, set up some kind of environment. So I thought it'd be a great start. But anyway, for all of you who've sent stories in, please be patient. I'm gonna get to it. I'm gonna start firing up at this point a little bit and trying to share maybe at least once a week if I can, and then we'll get into going full time again. So sit back, enjoy the sounds of the outdoors. We got crickets and cicadas and probably some frogs and whatever else going out here. So we'll hear. I'm going to get started. All right. So this is Trevor. Steve. My name is Trevor. This is my real name. I'm not ready to share my full name at this time. Maybe in the future. I hope you don't mind. I've been hesitant to share this story with you or anyone else for that matter, but I've been watching your videos and reading your replies for quite a while now. I really like the setting and how polite and gracious your audience is. Obviously, I watch other channels too. I just haven't felt compelled to share those stories with anyone else. So I decided to go ahead out on a limb and share my story with you and your viewers. If you choose to share this on your channel, you may think it's a bit far-fetched. Oh, we've heard a lot of them, so we don't judge that way. When I was a young boy, my parents sent me to spend the summer with my grandparents in Kansas. My father grew up there, but after getting married, he moved a couple of times. First to Wyoming, and then ended up in South Carolina. My father told me I should spend some time with them while we still have them. I found out later that he wanted to go on vacation without kids. Hawaii, I think. Go figure. But I am glad he did, because we lost Grandma the next year. She was 101 years old. Wow. My grandpa passed away 2 years after her. He was said to be somewhere in the area of 113 years old. That's incredible. But no one actually knows for sure. He didn't have a birth certificate and never got a driver's license. Not that that stopped him from driving. I grew up in and around the city of Charleston, South Carolina, and always had something to do. So I fully expected I'd hate my summer there, out in the country. But I was surprised about how much fun I ended up having and how much I learned. My grandfather was like a really old Boy Scout leader. At around 100 years old, he would use his old walking stick and we would hike all over the woods and hills. You could tell his Pawnee roots ran deep. He told me all about the plants and the trees and how everything was connected. He showed me what plants and berries we could eat and which ones would make you sick or give you a really bad case of the squirts. Speaking of which, he showed me what leaves make good toilet paper and which ones didn't. I believe he enjoyed spending time out in the woods with me just as much as I did with him. One day we set out. He said we needed to move along, because there was a bad rain coming. I thought it was cool because I loved playing out in the rain anyway, but was shocked that he wanted to go out and really had walked far when it started raining. I asked where we were going a couple of times because this path wasn't familiar to me. He just said, keep up, we're almost there. Keep up, we're almost there. 100 years old, he's telling a kid to keep up. Goodness gracious, I would have liked to have met him. We arrived on the side of a steep hill. He looked at me and said, "We are here," but all I saw was a big patch of trees up in front of us. He knelt down next to me and said, "Listen, do you hear her?" I looked at him and then looked around, then told him, "I don't see anyone. Who is she? Where is she?" He said, "Listen closely and you will hear her song." I did as he said and listened and tried to ignore the sound of the rain. Then I heard it. It got loud and then soft, then loud and faded out again, like adjusting the sound of a radio. I said, "I hear her, Grandpa. She is humming. Where is it coming from?" He smiled and said, "She is the soul of the mountain." He started walking, and I followed him behind the thick bunch of trees to the mouth of a cave. Now I could really hear her singing deep inside the cave. I said, "Grandpa, that's just the wind." He replied, "Is it?" and smiled and asked me if I wanted to meet her. Just inside the cave was a circle of rocks that formed a fire pit. Off to the side was a pile of brush. I realized later that Grandpa must have visited this cave often. These little bugs. I too returned once after he passed away. Our names are still etched on the cave wall. He said, "Now we have to start a fire so I can tell you a story." He handed me a couple of sticks and with a string on one. It was an old-fashioned bow for lighting a fire. He tried to show me how to work it, but I didn't have any luck at all. He said maybe he'd better try to get it going before it gets too late. I don't think it took him more than a couple of minutes and the fire was going. I figured I must have gotten it close to starting for him. There you go. We got as comfortable as we could on a couple of rocks. He pulled out his pipe and Zippo lighter. Yes, you heard me right. He always had a Zippo lighter with him. I'll never forget the distinct smell of that lighter and the pipe tobacco, or the blister I got in the palm of my hand from trying to light that fire. Oh, that's good. Grandpa took a couple of puffs off his pipe and blew a smoke ring right over the top of the fire. I thought that was the coolest thing ever. He asked me about school and if I liked it, and of course I said it's okay. He asked if they'd teach us about the presidents and if I knew who Theodore Roosevelt is. And I said, yes, I've heard of him. He was a president a long time ago. He said, did your teacher also tell you that he was a hunter and an explorer? I said, I didn't know. I guess I wasn't paying that much attention at the time. Then I asked him why. Did you know him? To my surprise, he said yes. When he was a boy, he met him. He said, I'll tell you the story about, but you have to promise not to tell your teacher or anyone else because they won't believe you anyway. Of course, I promised, and he continued to say, my father was a very important man. When other important people came to talk with my people, they talked to him first. My father was also a hunter and explorer. He would often leave for days, sometimes weeks. One time, when my mother wasn't well, my father told me to pack for a trip. My grandpa said he'd been on many hunting trips with his dad. But this was different. His father was very serious and rushing around. He got all groomed up and made me do the same. We brought out our stuff outside on the porch, and I saw a few motor cars coming down the dirt road with a trail of thick dust behind them. They pulled up in front of the house, and a few men got out of the cars to look around. My father didn't say anything. He just stood there and waited. After a while, the men stopped. One of them walked over to one of the motor cars and opened the door. I saw a man in tan-colored suit turn and set his feet on the ground. They talked for a moment, and then the man in the car turned and looked at us. He stood up and smiled as he put his hat against his chest and looked around. My father and I waited. I asked who the men were, but he didn't answer me. The man placed his hat back on his head and started our way. He smiled and said, "This is a fine place you have here. Are you the gentleman I am supposed to meet up with?" My jaw dropped when my father replied, "Yes, Mr. President, I am honored to meet you." That's when I realized he was who he was and why my father acted so different. He said, "No, sir," and extended his hand out. "The honor is all mine, and you can just call me Ted or Teddy if you choose." He pointed and asked about our bags and stuff we had packed, and then turned to the other men with a motion, and they came and loaded the stuff up in the cars for us. My father looked down at me and smiled. He said, "Don't be scared. I remember my first time riding in a motor car." He climbed in and sat down. Our backs were to the driver, and we sat facing President Theodore Roosevelt himself and one of his men. Yeah, see, now that got me the first time when you said motor cars a couple of times, and then I realized we're talking about President Roosevelt. We're talking about the turn of the century here. So, like, cars were a real new thing still. We rode for hours. My father and Ted talked a lot about the places they had both been. Of course, Ted had been all around the world, and my father had only traveled within the USA as far as I knew. My grandfather recalled President Roosevelt talking about Africa, but said he was so busy looking out the window that he didn't pay much attention to them talking. He said, "We arrived at a big ranch. The drive must have been at least 2 miles long, with horses on both sides leading up to the home. We waited in the motor car with Ted as the other men got out and looked around. Then, just like at our house, the man came and opened the door. He spoke quietly with Ted, and then one by one we got out. The house was huge with several big barns. A man in a cowboy hat came out of the house and straight for us, hollering, 'Teddy, how was the trip? It's good to see you.' Teddy reached out and shook his hand. I remember the sound of their hands as they cupped together. They must have been good friends. They talked a bit, and Ted introduced us to the man. He invited us in and showed us around the big house. He had a lot of animals hanging on the walls all throughout the house, all along with guns and fancy paintings. The man put on a big meal for us, bigger than I'd ever seen. He had people bringing the food to us and taking things away. After we ate, I asked if I could go look around at the horses. The man said, "Yes, but be careful and don't go far." As I was leaving, I saw Ted motion to one of the men, and the man followed me the whole time. It was strange, but I guess I did feel safer in this strange place. We spent the night there, and I tried to sleep in the biggest, softest bed I'd ever seen, but I didn't like it. So I put my blanket on the floor and I slept there. I did like the blanket, though. It smelled really nice. Early in the morning, I heard a lot of commotion, so I got up and walked downstairs. Everyone was eating and talking. My father came to me and said, "These people work here. They are coming with us." He told me to go eat and get ready because we would be leaving soon. I remember seeing Ted standing in front of the fireplace smoking a big cigar. He looked very serious until he looked at me and seen me. Then he smiled and gave me a nod. It was still kind of dark as we were leaving. They loaded all the stuff on horses. My father rode up to me and reached down for me so I could climb up on with him and rode. I always wondered what my father did when he left for days and sometimes weeks at a time. Now I thought I knew. We rode all day and set up camp just before dusk. Over the next 3 or 4 days. When we arrived, we set up camp at a base of a big tree-covered hill. It was still a bit early. I knew we must have arrived because when they set up camp this time, it was bigger. They even dug out a place for a tent-covered outhouse. My father and a couple of guys rode out every day. I asked where they were going. He just said exploring the area. I asked if I could go with him, and he said, "No, it's better you stay here." On the fourth day, he and the others rode back in kind of a rush. One of the men ran to Ted's tent, then waved to my father over. He went into the tent, and a few minutes later came back out. My father came to me and said, "Stay here and don't leave the camp." I asked where he was going. He said he's taken Mr. Roosevelt to talk to some very important people. Or someone very important, I'm sorry. I watched as my father, Ted, and a couple of other guys walked up the hill into the trees. I thought it was strange that they went on foot. I wanted to follow them really bad. I wanted to see who they went to talk to and why. But as usual, Ted left one of the men to keep an eye on me. Except this time, he wasn't paying as much attention to me as he was tending the horses. So I walked into my tent, making sure he's seeing me, then snuck out the back of the tent and ran for the woods. They were easy to follow because they made no attempt to hide the trail. I asked my grandfather if he was scared of getting lost or caught by his father. He said, yes, I was scared half to death. But he said I didn't travel that far with them just to turn around and go back home without knowing why we were there. He continued, I followed the trail up the hill until I heard them talking just ahead. I carefully snuck up closer until I could see Ted. He was holding his hat to his chest again. My father was across from him and talking to someone in a language I didn't understand. I know it wasn't Pawnee or any other native language that I'd ever heard. Then I heard someone talking back to him in the same language, but I couldn't see him. I could just make out an outline of someone very big, much bigger than my father or Ted. I saw one of the other men setting up something behind them. I wasn't sure what it was at the time. I heard my father say something about the man wanting his people to be safe and left alone. Ted told my father to tell him that he will do everything he can to protect them from other people. He thanked him for meeting them. They exchanged words for a little while, but it was very hard to hear everything they were saying. When they finished, Ted reached his hand out, and my father said something in that other language. I seen a massive hand reach out to Ted's hand as the man stood up. I hadn't realized he was sitting. They were face to face until he stood. He towered over my father and Ted. He was covered in hair from head to foot. My heart was pounding through my chest. I couldn't believe my eyes. I had only heard stories about forest people, but I'd never seen one. My father and Ted stood in front of him facing the man that was setting up some kind of equipment. All at once, there was this blinding flash of light. It was so bright I fell backwards and rolled over some brush. As hard as it was to see, I ran down the hill as fast as I could. I knew I was in big trouble if I got caught. I must have blindly ran into every tree and branch on that hill. I can imagine. About halfway down, Ted's man grabbed me out of nowhere. He said, slow down, boy, you're going to get hurt. He took my hand and led me back to camp. I knew I was going to be in big trouble when my father returned, so I climbed straight into my tent and pretended I was asleep. I must have fallen asleep because I didn't hear him come in when he returned in the morning. Oh, and in the morning, he reached in and shook my foot to wake me. He said, come eat, we will be leaving soon. I looked over at his side and his bedding was already rolled up and ready to go. Just like before, everyone else was already about done eating and packing up the horses. Before long, we rode out. My father hadn't mentioned anything about what had happened the whole time back. When we returned to the big ranch, we unpacked the horses and loaded the motor cars to leave. We must have been halfway back home when Mr. Roosevelt patted my knee and smiled at me. He asked, did you have a good trip, son? I said, yes, sir. Very much so. He looked at my father, and their eyes both followed back to me. Oh, then he said, was you scared at all? I said, no, sir. He said, that's good, very good. So you do understand that you can't talk about what you saw out there, don't you? Oh, okay, so he's asking. He says, so you do understand you can't talk about what you saw out there, don't you? I looked at my father thinking, this is it. He's going to have my hide. But he looked at me and with a serious look and nodded his head to answer Mr. Roosevelt. And I said, yes, sir, not a word. But can I ask you a question, Mr. President? He said, sure, fire away. I looked him straight in the eyes, and he leaned in so close I could see my reflection in his glasses. And I asked, was you scared? He leaned back in his seat and reached into his pocket, pulled a cigar out, then put it in his mouth. He chewed the tip a bit while looking at me, then took it out of his mouth and said, we are all scared sometimes, son. It's how we handle that fear that defines us. I replied, I bet you're not scared of anything, are you? He smiled and said, you would be surprised, boy. I think your father's the fearless one here. Then he turned and looked out the window. The rest of the ride was quiet. Everyone was tired, I guess. When we got home, Ted and my father spoke alone for a while before Ted left. He smiled at me and said, "You're going to be a fine young man." I watched them drive away with a cloud of dust following them until I couldn't see them anymore. I never got in trouble for sneaking out to follow them. Instead, my father took me on more trips with him and told me several stories about his explorations and the people he had met. I told some of these stories to your father when he was a young boy too, but I never saw President Roosevelt after that. I only heard sometime later someone tried to kill him, but he is a strong man, not so easy to scare or kill. That was the end of the story, the best I remember it. My grandfather told me several stories that summer, and we spent quite a few nights in that big, beautiful cave. I'll tell you more about another time. I think this is already too long. You'll have to forgive me. I tend to be long-winded like my grandfather. At least that's what my father told me. After my grandfather passed away, we had to go clean out his estate. My father found an old tin box buried in the back of Grandpa's dresser drawer. In the tin, he found some very old, likely valuable coins, some foreign money, and some other trinkets. But most importantly, he found an envelope with an old black and white photo. My grandfather never told me what that flash was that blinded him, but I know now. My father showed me the photo with a tear in his eye. It was President Theodore Roosevelt on the left, my grandfather on the right, and a real-life forest person, aka Bigfoot, in the middle. You could barely make him out, though. He must have moved suddenly when the flash went off, but it was good enough you could see what you were looking at. Funny, though, my grandfather's eyes were half closed, but Mr. Roosevelt just stood there with his hat to his chest and smiled. I couldn't tell if his eyes were open because of the flash in his glasses. Anyway, my father placed the picture back in the box and closed it. What he did with it, I'll never know. I may never know. I don't really expect too many people to believe my story, and that's okay. I can't say I blame them. I can't say I entirely believed it until I seen that picture either. I did ask my father if he still had it. He said it's somewhere safe. He just doesn't remember where he placed it. I hope you enjoyed my story and it's not too long. You're welcome to share it if you want to. When I get a chance, I'd like to send you a couple more fun stories my grandfather told me. Oh, and good luck with your upcoming house build. You're lucky to be able to do that stuff yourself. I wouldn't dream of trying to build a house by myself. But I'll be watching for it. Your friend, Trevor. Wow. All right. So, a few bugs and a lot of sweat. It's humid. Trevor, thank you so much for sending that in. I know everybody's going to love that. God, I wish you had that picture. If you ever get a chance to get that, we would absolutely love to see that. I mean, I don't think anybody's going to be able to, figure out who your grandfather is. I mean, I don't know how many pictures of him there are out there around. So, I mean, I would think it'd be fairly safe to show it to people. Man, I would love to see that. Wow. That would be absolutely, there it is. That would be absolutely amazing to see. But thank you for sharing that. I hope you guys enjoyed that story. I don't think it was too long. That's a great story. I could have listened to that, read that for a long time with no problem at all. Thanks for joining me here again. We're going to keep going on this house. I'm going to keep trying to share some of these stories with you guys every chance I get. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you again really soon.